Hello and welcome to Rebuild. My name is Bradley Belch, and as always, I'm joining my brother Michael. Here on Rebuild, our goal is to rebuild all of society in a way that honors God. This used to be known as Christendom, and we want to see Christendom restored. To that end, we explore the pillars that hold up the foundation of Christianity and Western civilization. We examine where and how these pillars are crumbling, and we think about what we can do to rebuild them. We try to release one interview each week and then provide a follow-up episode where Michael and I talk about the previous episode together and just give some extra thought after some time away from it. And then we also write one shorter article per week. And all of that content can be found on our website at rebuildpodcast.com. And we also have YouTube channels, and I guess we're on all the media sites too. Joining us today is the co-host of the podcast All Things Bright and Beautiful, Lydia Schaible.
Nope, Schaible. Close. You were close. No one knows how to say our name. I don't even know if I know how to say our name.
You are the co-host of a podcast All Things Bright and Beautiful. What is that podcast about, and what's the significance of the name? Because I have a feeling like there's probably a story there.
Yeah, well, so I can't take any credit for the name. My co-host is my pastor's wife, and he actually came up with the name from the hymn "All Things Bright and Beautiful." So it's like a survey through literature, Christian living. So we generally pick like a book. It's not like a book review, but each episode we kind of pick a book and launch off to discuss various, art, Christian living, all of the above. It's been a good time.
Yeah. I've listened to several of the episodes. I think generally, I could correct me if I'm wrong, it's geared towards a female audience.
Yeah.
But applicable
generally.
To all.
Yeah. We have a fairly wide audience, but mostly women.
Similar to how I feel about Allie Beth Stuckey.
Yeah.
Excellent content, but definitely from a mother's perspective. So it's very good. Anyone listening should check that out. She's also, Lydia also writes an excellent blog that you should know about and follow. It's called oceansneverfill.com. You have 4 kids, right? Is there anything else that I missed that you want to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'm married, 4 kids. Yeah. Homeschool them. So that keeps most of my time. That's about it. You pretty well covered all the bases.
All right. Well, I'm going to set the stage here then, and then we'll dive into some questions. With our previous 2 guests, we focused on kind of the Christian foundation that as we see it, all the pillars of Western civilization are built on, this kind of Christian foundation. This week, we want to discuss the pillar of education and culture. Specifically, we want to talk about the rich heritage of literature in Western civilization. We want to talk about the importance of story and narrative, and how to get back into literary shape, so to speak, as a society. As always, we hope to illustrate how God's word fuses and interweaves into all areas of our life. In literature specifically, we see that God's standard and order for the world that he created provides the blueprint for all truth and beauty that literature, at its best, reflects back to the reader. Do either of you have anything you want to add to that, or any comments on that before we ask questions?
It's pretty good. I'd say it's a pretty good definition. Yeah.
I'll just add, I'm an aspiring writer, I guess I'll say that. And I, for a short time, was in a band. And I used to get asked the question, what makes Christian art? And recently I ran across a quote from Martin Luther, something to the effect of, what makes a Christian cobbler, is first and foremost that he makes excellent shoes out of his love for God. And so sometimes when we talk about art and Christianity, or literature and Christianity in contemporary culture, at least, it kind of gets a bad rap for being Christian women's fan fiction, or, apocalyptic literature, or cheesy kind of Hallmark type movies. So really hoping that we can draw on what should be first and foremost, that Christian artists make the most excellent art that they can in an effort to honor God with their labor.
Yeah, and actually, I would add to that. I was just recently talking to to Abigail Dodds and just asking questions about writing. And one of the things that she pointed out specifically with writing, and I think you could apply this to any art medium, was we can, as artists, if you could file writers underneath that as well, there's this sort of weird thing that can happen where it becomes an identity as an artist. And you can think of art as a self-actualization, but for Christians, art is an act of service. And so when we write, we're writing for people. When we produce art, it's for people to somehow edify them and ultimately draw them to God and glorify God. So I thought that was a helpful way to kind of shift how we think about it too.
Very good. All right. Lydia, we live in a time when more books are being written and bought than ever before. You touch upon this a little bit in one of your podcasts, I think early on. Yet, as a society, we seem to be increasingly unfamiliar with the literature that formed a common perspective and language within American culture. Even only a few generations ago, these literary works were common and pervasive and influential. Could you talk a little bit about the importance of reading, teaching, and preserving literature?
Yeah, so I guess I'll break it down into three: reading, teaching, and preserving. Maybe I'll start with preserving. I think, well, obviously, in order to be able to read and teach it, we have to preserve it. We have to maintain this heritage that we have come out of, and for better or for worse, I think sort of the Western, and I'm sure you guys talk about this, but the Western culture as sort of critical race theory has come into play. There's this sort of cynicism towards anything written in the past, and just I mean we should as Christians be able to admit, yes, there were poor thought in these historical books that we read. There's poor thought now in the books that we're reading as well. You're never going to have a perfect text outside of Scripture. That doesn't mean we should just throw it out and sort of erase it from our history. One, that you can't erase yourself from history. We're part of our history. So our culture is built, whether we like it or not, it's built on this Western canon that we have. And so much of understanding where we are today, we have to be able to go back and read how we got here. So keeping that in mind, I think, is essential. And you can even still approach it critically. You can approach it and admit, like, there were ugly sins in the history of our nation and the history of American literature, and even before that, but that doesn't take away the things that are true and that we can glean from them well. And we stand on the shoulders of that. So what we have today is built from that. So it's just, I think it's naive and arrogant to do otherwise. So if we preserve it, it's silly to preserve it and not read it. I think we see a lot of that where people are just people don't read Shakespeare, so they're unfamiliar with how much of our language, the English language, was from Shakespeare largely. He's largely responsible for making it an educated language. And so to not read that is to really detach ourselves from who we are today, and to think that we're not somehow, and I think culture and literature and history all go together. You can't have one without the other. They're kind of tied. And so we can't understand our present if we just pretend like we're not somehow part of the past. And it's essential for us, I think, as parents and as educators to pass on an ability to read the classics and the sort of canon of literature that's essential to us. And that requires a certain type of education. And I think part of why we're seeing people are buying a lot of books, and I mean, that honestly, when you said that, surprises me, because I don't see people reading a lot. And even like reading blogs has gone kind of by the wayside, because people are more interested in reading Twitter or like Instagram sort of mini blogs. And so like the attention span of people is so short. And so the books that they are reading are not the kind of books that you really have to work at in order to find the treasure. I mean, you have to work to read Shakespeare. You have to work to read Homer. That takes a lot of effort. Yeah.
Yeah. I have a follow-up comment or question, I guess, for you. I was getting my master's degree right about the time that Common Core was rolling out and becoming popular. And it was so interesting, in an English setting, in a writing setting, kind of the outrage and the disappointment among some that we seem to be stripping a lot of the richness of our literature tradition in favor of, first of all, either, kind of the fascination with whatever they call technical texts, technical reading, but also kind of what you said with the CRT, like we've got to get rid of some of these oppressive pieces and we've got to put in, some other pieces. And it seemed to me that the people at the top were intentionally trying to create a new canon of what it meant to talk about story and literature, only leaving out and adding some significant things.
Yeah, and I mean, I'm not against adding these voices that maybe have not been part of our canon historically. And I think most people that you meet that are intellectually honest don't have a problem with that. It's the erasure of other voices that, I mean, we're not getting a clearer picture of history if we're doing that. So yeah, sure, let's add some other voices that were silenced in the past, but let's also continue to read these other things, because you're not going to even understand those if you're not coming from what was established prior to that these are being kind of born out of. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I know that I've been doing a lot of reading into the Reformation over the last year or so, and it's interesting to me that at the same time as we seem to be losing our literary tradition, I think evangelicalism in a lot of ways is losing its theological tradition, because I'm reading things in the Reformers that I'm like, wow, they thought about that. They thought about that. They talked about that. I had no idea. So, yeah. And your comment of these things running in tandem, history and literature and culture, it made me think, I wonder if it's social media or if, there seems to be a great forgetting in many areas of our culture right now.
That's a good way to put it. I think when you stop reading the history, you forget, like and it's just, it gets handed down in a way that's dishonest, because you're getting pieces from other people and you're not going to it to yourself to draw your own conclusions and to actually think through it well. And I think that's probably another topic entirely, but just learning how to think through what we read and evaluate ideas is just kind of lost in education at this point. And I don't know that I feel like people need to be trained in that to even begin.
Yeah, I feel like for a little while now, we've kind of been playing literary telephone, the
Yeah,
game of
that's a good way
telephone,
to
where
put it.
you whisper in somebody's ear and pass it down the line and see what you have at the end. Where we've just been telling each other what the work says for so long, without actually going back and reading the original works. And then you get to the end and you're like, well, what does that work actually say? You know the name maybe of of the author, but you don't actually know what it says, and then it loses all of its meaning and all of its weight. And so then people just go, oh well, that isn't important anymore, obviously, and then they, like you say, they go for the quickest, easiest hit on Twitter, or consumption of media wherever they can get it. That's a kind of a quick hot take. The hot take society we live in now. But yeah, I feel like we've just kind of diluted everything over time, without actually staying true to, we're going to read these books, for ourselves as a country. Are there any literary works that you think are must reads for Americans and people living in Western culture? Anything off the top of your head? I mean, I know it's kind of like, read all the books, but
Read all the books, yeah. Well, don't actually read all the books. That's probably not the best use of your time. Read the best books. Yeah. I mean, I generally would say there's a reason that when people talk about the classics, that they are called classics. They've stood the test of time. They are excellent writing. I always go back to Shakespeare, because I think we should begin there. That so much of being English speakers, it comes from that. I mean, that doesn't mean you should also be reading Homer and Plato and those things. I think are important to read too. But honestly, like for people who maybe are not familiar or haven't ever gone in, they're like, oh, I haven't really read any classics except maybe the Spark Notes I had to in high school or something. Looking at like a classics list, here's a list of the 100 classics everyone should read. Start there. You can't really go wrong with that, because again, they've stood the test of time. There is excellence there. And I think too, I mean, this is a rabbit trail, but I think part of the reason that we're seeing people reading and yet not willing to read the classics and this sort of, like you described, that telephone approach, it's not just that we want to forget our history or we want to rewrite our history. I think it's also we take sort of a utilitarian approach to reading in general and education in general. You see that a lot with the emphasis on STEM of like, okay, how can we teach kids something that they can then make into a career? And so instead of thinking, how can we learn and learn to have virtue and to love things in the right order and ultimately to glorify God with our minds. And that's not quite as clear cut. And so literature, when you pick up Shakespeare, say.
Well, and as you referenced, Jordan Peterson just a couple months ago had a pretty big interview with Rogan that went pretty popular, talking about how Shakespeare is basically the foundation of all, just above the Bible. And the Bible is the original book, and then everything spiders up and then trickles back down to Shakespeare and the Bible.
Yeah, I mean, you can trade most of his stories. You look at it and you're like, man, I feel like most stories that are good are Shakespeare already did them. And maybe that's just you can discuss the idea of sort of the archetype of story in general, and he was just doing that because only good stories can build on that archetype. But yeah, you don't pick up Shakespeare and think, okay, now I'm going to read Shakespeare, and even as Christians, you don't pick up Shakespeare and think, okay, this book is going to make me a better Christian today. And I mean, that's true, but eventually, yes, Shakespeare can make you think about, he can make you think about things like sin and repentance and hardness of heart and wickedness and all of these and love and all of these ideas. But it's not going to be something where you're like, okay, I got 10 steps to a better marriage by reading Shakespeare. That's not, you won't get that at all with Shakespeare. You might get 10 steps to like the worst marriage. Don't be Macbeth. But if we can take, like, sort of put that behind us of, okay, I got to make sure I got to make sure my reading pays off, and instead say, no, I'm going to go here and I'm going to do the work, and I'm going to trust that that by using my mind for God's glory, there will be fruit from that. And it's not an immediate fix. Not that those like Christian living immediate fix books are bad. But that shouldn't be the only approach that we have.
That actually, okay, so that's interesting that you brought up Christian living books, because first of all, it seems like a lot of Christian living books are not written with a design of being either intellectually or linguistically rigorous. And so, even if they are, it's exactly what you say. They're kind of pragmatic. The payoff that you're going for is something tangible in your life, not kind of the mental discipline or the enrichment of the quality of the writing. So that's a very interesting point, and I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily a criticism. I think Christian authors are seeking to meet people where they are, and there's definitely a place for that. I just don't think that should be the only place that Christians go for their own writing and for reading. There should be both. Yeah.
Well, so since we're talking about Christian subculture, I notice in myself even, and a lot of people that I talk to who are Christians, we kind of tend to gravitate towards the newest Christian leader's book, and seldom, maybe not seldom, but maybe in the same sense, ignore some of the classics of the Christian heritage. If you agree with that, or do you agree, and why might this be good and bad?
Yeah, I mean, I that's definitely true. I think we like the next new thing. There's also a concept of relevancy. It's a lot of times these books are being published because they're relevant for today. They're issues that we're seeing today. I benefit from many current Christian living books. They're wonderful. But what I've appreciated, even in the church that we now attend, because we just moved to North Carolina almost 2 years ago. And so our pastor and his wife love like the Puritans, and they recommend constantly like, I I can't remember the off. I think it's Jeremiah Burroughs, The Rare Jewel of Christian Contentment, and Jenna, my co-host, loves Pilgrim's Progress and Bunyan's other writing, and so they have this emphasis on encouraging our congregation read these books. And what I find really interesting is you talk about relevancy. Like, they're so relevant. You can read them. Like, I just read J.C. Ryle recently, and I was like, this could have been written today. It, like, these things that we wrestle with, we think like, oh, this is so unique to our generation. And there are unique aspects of what we're dealing with technology and various political issues. But the heart of those things, the reason technology is an issue for Christians, has to do with our hearts. And that those issues have been here forever. And so there is, read current books, yes, but also, yes, go back to those Christian classics, because they have so much to offer us. And there's this lens that they have, being outside of our current culture and time, that helps us identify our own blind spots that we wouldn't see, and that maybe current contemporary writers aren't going to see either.
Last fall, I read an essay by C.S. Lewis, and I forget the name of it now, but he basically asked the question, what do we as a culture have to provide a counterbalance against ourselves? And he said, all we have access to, we only live in our own present, and we don't know the future. So the only corrective that we have is to read the past and to try and see ourselves through the lens of the past. And I thought that was really an insightful comment that he made.
Yeah, he has. It might even be the same essay that you're talking about, where he talks about like the importance of classics and how that lens helps us. Yeah, like helps us enter. And that, I mean, that applies to classic Christian books and like we were talking about classics before. There's just a lot of things that we don't see because of our sort of like myopic view of where we are today.
Yeah. And like we said, kind of in the intro and all throughout, like God provides the ultimate truth and the ultimate beauty, and good literature is always going to reflect back to that, and it's going to portray that, the good, the bad, and the ugly, but it will tell God's story, or at least reflect God's story, knowingly to the author or unknowingly. We will see good art will reflect true beauty and true truth, which is God and His Word. So whether it's 100 years old, 500 years old, thousands of years old, they're still relevant. We can still glean quality reflections from them. It just takes a little bit of work, like you're saying. It takes work to both read it, but then to also kind of put the pieces together as you're going along. It's not the bullet pointed. Here's your 10 points, but they're there. It's there. So kind of transitioning from kind of the heritage of literature in Western Civ, kind of want to discuss stories and their impact, kind of in society and how they affect us. So, we live in an age where the primary thing that people read is news headlines, news articles, and even then, it's just like literally the headline for the most part. We've talked about it a little bit, but why should we take time away from that and read literature specifically, like actually read books?
Yeah, I think that I think it's in, I haven't read it in a while, in Amusing Ourselves to Death by Neil Postman. It's a great book. I definitely recommend it. He kind of argues that our sort of the shape of how we understand things and how we argue things comes from sort of the medium that we're learning from. So if the medium that we're learning from is just Twitter, our understanding and ability to think through things is 120 characters, as opposed to a 500-page book. There's just so much more when you have to, and it's, you could say, well, I read 500 pages worth of Twitter, but please don't do that. But like sitting with a book that's, I mean, even 200 pages long, and sitting with an argument or a story that runs that thread for that length of time, it requires more of us, but it also shapes our thinking in a way that allows us to get into the deeper understanding of things. And I don't really love the word nuance, because it's sort of it's just sort of like a hip book, like word in general, but there is nuance to things, and we can't really understand that when we're not taking the time to get into the depth of and if you're talking about something that's a complicated issue, you're not going to get a great understanding in 1,000 words or 120 characters. It's going to take a book to understand those things. And if we're Christians, God is something so huge. It requires, I mean, one, he's come to us through the written word. He came physically as the word, and then the way he's revealed himself to us is through the written word. That's what he chose. He chose that time period. I think it's John Piper that argues that, I mean, he could have come when podcasts were invented, right? He could have come at any point in time, but he came when writing was the way that he could spread, like the word of who he was could spread. And so that does mean Christians should be able to read well. Does that mean you have to read well to be a Christian? No. But in order to grow in your faith and to mature, reading scripture and understanding it requires that we become good readers. And we have to read something more than just Twitter, because you have to sit with ideas longer than that to really understand them and work through them and think clearly. So, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I have well, this is the question that I've been thinking about off and on over a period of time, but why do you think that God gave stories in literature to us? And also related to that, the Bible is multiple genres of writing, but there are parts of the Bible that we would consider literature. So what is the importance to God, do you think, or some of the importance to God? It's a deep question. What importance does he place on literature, do you think?
Yeah, and that's so the education sort of philosophy. I promise this ties in. It's not so far outside of your question. I'm coming to it. But so the education philosophy we follow in our home for homeschooling is Charlotte Mason. And the whole bulk of her philosophy rests on what she calls living books and this idea of story-driven truth. So it can be story-driven history, story-driven science, all of these things. And what she argues is this is the best way that people learn. So people learn best through story. We and children especially, but I think all the way through adulthood, that's how we learn well. And so I resonate well with that just as a mother in my own experience and seeing how children understand things when you tie it to an illustration of a story. Just an idea that maybe if you just gave this abstract fact, they're not going to retain it. They're not going to internalize it in a way that makes that concept where they're going to think, okay, how does this affect me, and what should I do in response to this as a person? It just ends up being sort of this free floating fact without tying it in a way that they becomes part of their education and the whole of who they are in that classical sense of building virtue and educating the whole person. And so I think that carries over well into adulthood. And in scripture, I mean, Jesus teaches through story. The parables are stories. And like you said, I think you could argue that scripture itself is a grand arch of story. It has history, it has proverbs, it has wisdom literature, it has poetry and all those things. But the whole thing is this story arc that you see. And I think as humans, we long to tell stories. There's a reason. I mean, even as we've moved away from maybe books, with telling stories has been sort of part of human nature forever. We've always told stories in order to understand things and in order to explain things, to pass down information. So I think it's essential to being human. And I think that's the way that God meets us, because story is one of those things where you can take an abstract concept, like with children, you can take something that you have no personal connection to, but through story, you can understand it because it sort of puts you right in that place.
Yeah. So as you're talking about story, I've got one comment and then another question. The reason Jesus uses story and parables is because it forces us to actually think about the meaning. Jesus could just as easily tell us, in the parable of the mustard seed, have a little bit of faith and you'll get into the kingdom of heaven. He could just tell us what he wants us to know, but by telling us story and telling us parable, he forces us to actually think through what he is telling us and come to the conclusion, which I think can be frustrating for Christians sometimes. I think a lot of us, especially in this day and age, want that, like, just tell me what to do. But when we force ourselves to actually think and analyze, we get to the same conclusions, but through the eyes of story and what Jesus is trying to convey in the whole story, not just this is what you need to do. So then story also plays into narrative. And I think this day and age, stories are less relevant than what narratives are. So they kind of go hand in hand, but now everything is about what the narrative is. So the narrative about gender, the narrative about the evils of traditional marriage, whatever the narrative is, and everything is written and driven and geared towards how we shape narrative. What would you agree that this is kind of where we're at, and is that good for society? I mean, it still ties into story. Is it inevitable for society to be a narrative driven? Kind of any thoughts on kind of a transition that we have from just story to driving narrative?
Driving narratives. Yeah, I think the idea of a narrative has probably always existed. What's unique about right now is so like the sort of the history of narrative within feminism is really interesting, because feminists have sort of pushed this idea that we can shift the social imagination through narrative, through story. So there's been a heavy emphasis on feminist authors, especially, to use narrative to sort of their advantage in order to sway opinion. And in my opinion, it's been very successful. People are very easily swayed by maybe some of the worst arguments I've ever read by people who include this sort of personal narrative. So I think there's that attachment to it. A lot of what we're seeing now, I think, is an intentional twisting of story in order to drive home these new paradigms in order to shift opinion. I think you could argue that Christians do the same thing, though. But what we're doing is just true. So we also have a narrative that we're bringing to the table when we do anything. But the difference is our narrative is gospel centered and it's not human centered. And I think what we're seeing kind of today in narrative, maybe versus what we've seen 100 years ago or prior to that, is this very me-centered narrative where there is no. I mean, I know people talk about postmodernism a lot, but that is the culture that we live in. I mean, it's maybe postmodernism, but there is this sense that there is no, like, once you hit sort of Nietzsche, where he basically says there is no moral ground. God is dead, therefore morals don't exist. There is no common story. There's no common human story. There's no attempt to try to find it. Because even when we had conflicting ones prior to that, there was at least a sense of, well, we have to find what the common story is. And that's why when you go back to reading the Greeks or something, there is this sense of there is a moral code, even if we don't agree entirely with their moral code. There is something of this sense of no, there is a central human center, and our whole narrative should center around that as we try to figure out what that is. Whereas now it's kind of a free for all, which in some ways, as you kind of watch it unfold, you're like, it kind of eats itself because they end up conflicting so much that I think you see that with feminism and the transgender movement, where these two narratives end up being naturally conflicting. But they can't really do much with it because there's no one has any sort of moral ground to stand on to say, well, what you're saying is wrong, because we've all been working from personal narrative. And so what's my narrative? What does my narrative, how can I say my narrative is better than your narrative if we've been saying personal story is all that matters? So I think that's probably the biggest transition. It's not so much that narrative is the center as much as it is my narrative is the center. Yeah.
That's really interesting, Lydia. It seems like there's an old proverb that I read, and it was attributed. These things have just like Arabian proverb or whatever. So who knows if it actually is? But an old thing that I read said, "Stories tell us how to live and why." But if our culture is becoming increasingly infatuated with my own personal narrative, this seems to circumvent the element of storytelling which tells us something about ourselves, where when we look at a story, we are reflected. And if what you're saying is true, and it totally sounds right on, that our narratives now are self-constructed, I wonder if story loses a lot of that ability to reflect back to us something that is other than ourselves, that causes us humility or self-reflection, or any of those things that maybe good stories cause us to do.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because I mean, the best stories, when we walk away from them, we tend to walk away changed, right? There's something about them that draws us up and out, or further up and in, as Lewis would say.
Right.
But yeah, this sort of me-centered narrative is so all self-consuming. You can't, there's no looking out of it there, and there's no demand for personal change, because how dare you tell me to change something about myself? Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah, and we wonder why we're in the identity society, where I am my own identity and I define my own identity, and you don't have my lived experience, right? So lived experience start playing into all of that, and it's a you can't contradict it, because we society lives in a, well, that's their truth. It's like, well, but there
That's
is
not a
truth.
thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you were saying, it kind of eats itself, and I think in the not too near future, not too distant future, it'll collapse on itself pretty hard. I think that is not too far around the corner.
I think we're seeing it. Sorry, I think
Yeah.
we're seeing it collapse a lot on itself. I think with this generation, I mean, I guess my generation is like millennial, like generation, and then what is the one that comes after us? I don't know. It's not Gen X. That's before
Punks.
us. Do you say punks?
Yeah.
Yeah, they're so much worse than us.
Yeah.
But this next generation coming up,
Z.
maybe Z. I don't know. We'll have to start the alphabet soon again. But you see this sort of disoriented thing, and I think we're going to see these children, because they're children in a lot of ways, are going to emerge from this. And I hope that the church is sort of ready, and we've equipped our kids with this worldview to kind of come to them and say, like, because I think they're going to see this worldview that they have, and that is built on nothing, and is so chaotic and confusing and disorienting in so many ways, that they're going to come out of that, and that our children and their generation can meet that, and us as adults as well, and come to them and say, we have something so much better for you. And my prayer is that the church will be, and kind of like what you guys are talking in this rebuilding idea, it's not just that we criticize culture at large and just say, look how bad they are, but we actually have a positive culture that to offer the world that is so much better. And I think we're going to see, I mean, that's my prayer, is we're going to see these kids coming looking for that, because they will be sort of like, I think they'll recognize the unhappiness in the world that has been built for them.
I'm going to keep us on this rabbit trail for just a second. I've been thinking a lot about identity recently, and the transgender movement, and I think it was R.C. Sproul. If it wasn't him, it was someone else, who basically made the offhanded comment of, previous generations would have had no idea what you meant when you asked, like, what is your identity? But I've been thinking about identity, and I've realized that really, in a lot of ways, identity is not something that we find for ourselves, but that is given to us. And particularly in the area of gender or sexuality, first of all, it's given to us by God. But second of all, in the past, what the story that we told about what it meant to be a man and what it meant to be a woman, and it was always imperfect, of course, but that was a story that was told to us, that we then kind of conformed ourselves to, and confidence and security came from shouldering the load of the responsibility of the story that you were told about yourself. And so to be a good mother or a good father or a good worker brought with it a certain sense of confidence and security of your place within society, that because that story about that we are unreceptive to an outside story about who we are, it leaves us just really anchorless and with no confidence or I don't even mean eternal hope. I just mean no sense of hope of anything in this life because no one's telling us who we are.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's so I've actually been thinking about identity a lot. Like, I mean, it is kind of the thing on the table right now. I'm also reading Carl Trueman's. So he wrote The Rise and Triumph of the Modern Self, which I read that one last year. It's great. But then he also wrote sort of like a shortened, more accessible version. It's called Strange New World, I think. So I'm currently reading that, and it's excellent. Again, that one's a really helpful resource to sort of see how did we get here on a lot of these things. But this idea of identity, I think, is really crucial because I look at even some mothers in my generation who see, okay, I've entered motherhood and so much about who I thought I was has changed. There's the things I liked to do I can no longer do. My time is no longer my own. And if our identity is resting on these outside things about who we think that we are and not on I'm a woman in Christ, then those changes are going to be so disorienting and difficult for us because we're going to think I don't know who I am. But if our heart is rooted in the reality of I'm a woman and that's unchangeable, and I'm in Christ and that's unchangeable, then those shifting things really don't matter as much, and we don't even really need to spend all the time navel gazing of trying to figure out who am I, because we can just live obediently in the roles that we've been given. Am I married? I'm a wife. I'm going to live in that role and follow what God says to do. Am I single? Okay, what does God say for me to do as a single person? Am I a mom? Okay, what do I do? But we by sort of shifting away from that, we have so overly confused and complicated something that I don't think needs to be that complicated. And like you were saying, it takes away sort of that sturdiness to be able to sort of just set our feet on and get to work, and just do what we've been called to do, and with just a lot of unnecessary angst that I just don't think we need to have.
As you're talking, you're painting a picture of a overly tired 2-year-old about to go to bed, throwing fits, like we're just desperately flailing, like I can't move, I can't get undressed, but we're like that's kind of what the picture that I feel like we're at right now. And shortly, like we're saying, we're probably going to sleep pretty sound and pretty hard and wake up with
I feel better.
I feel better. I see things so much more clearly now. Yeah, you're exactly right. And just like when our identity is outside of ourselves, we kind of buck against it, and everything tosses us. And James says that too, right? Like the book of James, we tossed by every wind, and we're there now for sure. All right, so we've talked about some narrative story. We've talked about kind of the history of the heritage of our literature. Let's talk about how we self-correct or how we correct. I think it was in your first episode of your podcast, All Things Bright and Beautiful, which if you like what Lydia's saying, and even if you don't, you should go check that out because it's a valuable conversation that her and her co-host, I forget your co-host's name though.
Jenna. Yeah.
Jenna, it's valuable conversation. But you mentioned several times in that episode that reading is, especially the further removed we get from it, is a daunting task for some. And you compare it to exercise. And as I was listening to that, I was like, man, I feel like our culture is 600 pounds overweight right now. Our society is 600 pounds overweight, sometimes literally, but also just like in thought and in clarity with literature. We're just way overweight, and we have no idea how to even start losing that weight. So could you talk a little bit about where we should start? How do we start the I mean, it's one thing when you want to lose 20 pounds here or there, that's one thing, but we're like my 600-pound life, status right now. And it seems insurmountable, but it's not. So can you expound on that a little bit?
That's actually a really helpful illustration, like the trying to go from that extreme, because you would not advise that person to just go on some sort of starve yourself diet and to lose it all in 2 days, right? If you're not someone practiced in reading, I'm not going to tell you to go pick up Dostoevsky and read it. Don't start there. you'll be disappointed, you'll be frustrated, and you'll probably give up. Look to try to get there. Like, I would start by saying, okay, what do I really want to read that I recognize maybe right now I can't? Maybe it's okay, I've never read Shakespeare. I do want to eventually read Shakespeare. Think of that as sort of like your eventual goal, but start small. And I would say I always think any sort of spiritual discipline that because I think reading is a spiritual discipline, reading scripture is a spiritual discipline, and in order to read scripture well, we have to be good readers. So I think it's sort of an aim towards that direction as well. So it is a discipline that we have to work at, and I always think that we can do better with disciplines if we take some along with us. And I guess that's true for exercise too. If you have someone kind of holding you accountable, you're reading with someone else. So find someone who maybe they're a better reader than you, or maybe they're at the same point and they're just recognizing I want to read more, and just pick a book together and meet up and talk about it. Because a lot of times when we're reading something and it's difficult and we just sort of sit with our thoughts by ourselves, we kind of just get stuck. But if you have an opportunity to talk those thoughts out with someone else, it can kind of help you be like, oh yeah, I guess I didn't really see that, but now I do, and now I can kind of understand the book a little bit better. But as far as like choosing books, I would sort of, I mean, that's why Jenna and I started the podcast, was to give people book recommendations. So shameless plug, I guess, listen to our podcast. But also if you're part of a church, which I hope you are, if you're a believer, then ask your pastor for book recommendations. Like I said before, if you think you want to jump into the classics, pick from that list. I also think, I mean, we're talking about classics and sort of hard books that take effort, but I also don't think there's anything wrong with just picking up a book to enjoy it. I think sometimes, again, because we've had this sort of utilitarian approach to literature for so long, we don't know how to just enjoy reading. And sometimes I think just starting there is good, because once you sort of relearn, because I have never met a child who does not enjoy reading. Every child loves to be read to. And maybe once you get into the sort of the difficulty of learning how to read, that's something, but everyone wants to learn from stories, and everyone wants to read books when they start out, until it's sort of been ruined. And I won't go into all of my thoughts on how education has ruined that, but I if you can just find a book of like, or even if you think back on like your own childhood of like, I really liked this book that was, maybe it was written for a young adult audience, or maybe it was The Hobbit or something like that. Read that and start there and enjoy it, and take your time enjoying what good writing looks like. I would caution against choosing poor books, and by poor, I think there's 2 points in that. There's poorly written books. Don't waste your time there. There's so many well-written books that you don't need to spend your time reading books that are poorly written, unless you're trying to make a case for how poorly written they are or something. And also poor as in anything that leads you into sin directly, anything that is just, I mean, I would make a case that we should read non-Christian authors, but we shouldn't be reading books that are explicit in nature in a way that is explicitly sinful or causes us to sin. But outside of that, I mean, there's so much to choose from, and that can be overwhelming. So that's why I would say find someone that you trust to kind of give recommendations and kind of start there, and take people along with you. And I think also, and I know a lot of people, the same way they feel about reading is how they feel about writing. They don't like it unless they consider themselves a writer. They think that there are people who are writers, but I would say if you know how to write, just like if you know how to read, you are a writer and you are a reader. So if you are literate, you can write. And a lot of times the difficulty that we have in understanding ideas and sort of absorbing what we're reading and that kind of thing is because we don't take the time to sort of synthesize our thoughts, and writing is just a really helpful way to do that. And that doesn't mean you need to write like essays or publish anything, but just like journal out your thoughts after you finish a book of, what did I think of this book? Did I like it? What did I like about it? And that can just help you learn how to enjoy a book and to start thinking through what these books are trying to argue. I mean, I would argue that literature, even just like a storybook, is trying to teach you something. And so learning how to sort of think through that will help you be a more critical reader too. And you'll glean more the more you read if you do that. Did that answer your question?
Yeah, no, it does. I think those are super practical steps. I would add to that list, and you've set a good example of this in this podcast alone. Try and force. I think if we try and force ourselves to quote books or to refer back to books, we're great at it with movies and TV shows. We know all the lines. We know all the quotes. We have a pop culture of, if you say, whatever the buzz line for, or the catchphrase for that show is, everyone knows what you're talking about. I think even if people don't catch on right away, I think if you try and read in order to be able to quote, or in order to be able to say, I was reading this, instead of movies and shows. Now, I like movies and shows as much as the next person, but that is just the spirit of the age. That's what people gravitate towards. So the only way to pull away from that is to create a different center of gravity. So I think that's one way. And then you mentioned going back and rereading books that you enjoyed as a childhood, or even young adult books. And I am no fan of Harry Potter, but even in Harry Potter, there are true principles and truth that can be gleaned from that.
Because it's stolen even from Lord of the Rings. But that's
what's that?
Because it's stolen from Lord of the Rings. But
yeah, exactly. Which is stolen from Shakespeare, which is stolen from the Bible.
I don't know about
that. But there's truth. There's truth in those things. There's truth in the Hunger Games series, as light and hard, like. So reread those books by all means, or whatever good books are. Reread them, but reread them with an eye for what is this actually telling me, or what are, beyond just the like, oh, this is a fun story. Don't read them as if they're a movie. Read them as if they have something to tell you. And when you start looking at things that way, you start getting a lot more value out of the book itself.
And then I think that will help you when you do. I know I keep hitting on Twitter. I don't hate Twitter as much as I sound like I hate Twitter. But like, as you're encountering sort of these ideas elsewhere, having worked through them with books and learned how to sort of identify where people are leading through story, intentionally or not, it makes it much easier to start to identify those things elsewhere. And so you can think much more critically when you've sort of trained yourself to do that in these less, it's not a classroom. So do I really need to do this? And it's like, no, we should just be thinking people in general and engaging our minds, and not just reading passively, kind of like you described. And actually, so what you were saying about taking notes or being able to quote things. So Charlotte Mason, again, I love her, but she talks about keeping what she calls a commonplace book. And it's honestly one of the most helpful, practical things for reading. And what she advises is basically to just take quotes from books that you finished and write them in just this little book that you have, to just sort of have your, I don't know, store of ideas, or it can just be because it was beautifully written, and all of that. And so I've done that for the last few years, and it's amazing how that just starts to become part of your vocabulary. I think it's made me a better writer to just take the time even to just kind of rethink about those things after reading them. It also helps you. So what I do is I'll finish a book, and anything I've highlighted, I'll go back through and I'll write it in my commonplace book. And that also helps me to go back through the book and think, okay, what was the whole thesis of this book? What do I think about it? And kind of being able to do that in a quick way. That's really helpful.
Yeah. Again, all of it is work. Like we're trying to lose 600 pounds here. And that takes work, and it's not easy at first. That first step is obviously the hardest, and then every step there forward gets easier. Not that it ever gets easy, but it gets easier. If you have, Michael, do you have anything else to add to that?
Nope.
All right. So if you have a little bit more time, I'd like to ask you one kind of final question. We've been trying to make a point of talking about the definition of love with guests on our podcast. We think that how our culture, the battle over that definition is one of the primary battles to the chaos and confusion that we see, because what the world defines as love is simply not. But we still like the idea of love, right? Like we still want to use love as a like a silver bullet. Like if you say the buzzword love, then you can't counteract it.
All you need is
But
love.
yeah, exactly. Um, do you have any? This is putting you on the spot because I don't think we
You're just gonna have
pre-screened
me
this question.
define love on the spot.
No, I'm not. That was going to be the question. But in the spirit of literature, can you maybe help us understand how literature helps us understand love or helps us define it
Oh,
as
that's
we
a great
read literature?
question.
Are there any themes that you? I mean, obviously Shakespeare, you're going to find lots of themes of love, but does reading literature, does it help us understand what love is truly?
That's such a good question. I mean, so we know what love is from Christ, right? And the picture of him sacrificing himself on our behalf, and rescuing his enemies. So my favorite book, and I think the whole point of the book is love, is Les Miserables by Victor Hugo. It's an excellent book if you can get through. So Victor Hugo is paid by word. So there's a few parts where you're like, why are we spending 2 chapters on the Battle of Waterloo and the French sewer system? Or like Parisian sewer system? Not awesome, but worth it. Again, we talked about the work. It's worth all that effort because, especially, and a lot of people argue sort of like, you have the love affair with Marius and Cassette, which I think is actually pretty wimpy and lame. You have the love that Jean Valjean has for Cassette, which is quite impressive. But the ultimate point of love in that book is the priest for Jean Valjean, which is this Christ-like picture that you see. So Jean Valjean is, spoiler alert, I hope that doesn't matter that much to you. Jean Valjean is wrongly accused, and sits in prison for stealing a loaf of bread. And he's in prison for, I can't remember how long, but years. And he gets released from prison. And as soon as he's released from prison, he ends up sort of at this abbey's house. It's been a while since I read it, so I can't remember quite how he ends up there, except maybe traveling. So this priest takes him in, he feeds him, cares for him, lets him sleep in his home. And then when the priest is asleep, Jean Valjean wakes up and starts stealing from him. The priest wakes up and sort of catches him in the act, and Jean Valjean hits him over the head and knocks him out, so he can get away with what he's stolen. The authorities arrest Jean Valjean and bring him back to the priest's house because of what he's stolen. And the priest, instead of retaliating or condemning him, says, well, you forgot my candlesticks. And so he gives more on top of what Jean Valjean has stolen from him. So then then sort of the story takes from there. That love that the priest showed him, Jean Valjean then sort of seeks to repay by loving others. And so that's, I can't remember Cassette's mom's name, if either of you know. But anyway, that's kind of how he ends up with Cassette in his care and wanting to take care of her as an orphan. And but that scene alone, I mean, even if you don't read the whole book of Les Miserables, that scene alone, I think, is one of the best examples in literature of Christ-like love and sort of the love that we're called to. And not in like I mean, I think people could probably take that in sort of a Marxist direction, which would be silly because that's not what Hugo meant. But just that idea of all giving and that forgiveness, that, I mean, that we are Jean Valjean if you look at that picture, and that's what Christ has done for us as his enemies who have only betrayed him and only done evil. And then while we were still enemies, he's loved us and called us into life. So yes, I think there's lots of examples of that in, and you could also, the brothers Karamazov, there's Alyosha and his love for his brother, who's sort of an atheist, and Alyosha has faith, and how much he loves his brother, and sort of the telling of, there's a single chapter in that book called The Inquisitor, which honestly, again, is worth reading just by itself. Even if you don't read the whole book, it kind of stands alone. But the Christ figure in that story, the way he responds to the betrayal and the cruelty that he meets is to offer sort of he offers a kiss. But it's this beautiful portrayal of him again answering all of this evil with good and sacrifice. So in answer to that question, yes, I think literature is full. Good literature, good classics especially, is full of this. And it's also full of examples of where love is absent. Like you mentioned Shakespeare. I actually think most of Shakespeare's most impressive work is not where he portrays love like Romeo and Juliet, but when you look at like Macbeth or Hamlet and how he treats Ophelia, or Hamlet's uncle, and all of those things of just what it looks like when love is absent. And I think if our current culture were to look at those things, we would maybe have a better idea of, oh, this is actually what we're doing, and that's not love at all.
That's really helpful. And I think another thing that's helpful about that, and we said this earlier, so maybe this is kind of circling back, is just realizing that I'm saying this because you said, "Oh no, don't make me define love," and I came to a realization actually only last week that love almost needs a story to define it.
That's a good way to put it.
Like the dictionary definition of love, when we read it, we all know, no, that's not quite it. We all know, no, that's not quite it. And someone else offers, the new definition or a new definition of love. And it always falls a little bit flat when you hear someone define it. And yet you're exactly right. There are stories which so perfectly capture what love is that you immediately say, yes, that is how I want to love someone. That's how I want to be loved. You recognize, if you're Christian, that's how Christ has loved me. And it's this part of literature and story that God has given us where it transcends almost a kind of a didactic textbook definition. And so I really value what you're saying there of looking at those. But again, those stories take a while to develop. Even that chapter in the Grand Inquisitor, it's difficult to get through, and I think that's part of the lesson too. It's not a Hallmark card,
No.
it's deep and takes some
and really painful to read.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for those examples and that insight.
All right. Anything else you have for Lydia and Michael? I think that's the end of my questions.
I just really want to say thanks again for joining us. And I'll say a quick blurb of a housekeeping note to our listeners. If you're listening, we are always looking for guests who can talk about the elements of society and how we can understand them, and then also how we can kind of point ourselves and the people around us back to understanding how those things can be brought into service and submission to Christ. And so we hope that you will reach out to us if you know people. Also, the friendly reminder that Bradley and I will do kind of a follow-up with Lydia's thing, where we will kind of pull out, we won't be critical of Lydia, but we'll pull out some insights, and we'll post, if you're listening to this interview kind of early in the week, there's a good chance we haven't recorded that follow-up episode yet. And if you have some comments or questions that you want to have us include in our kind of analysis, please feel free to reach out to us. You can do that on our website, and we would welcome those comments. So, Bradley, I'll hand it back to you.
Yeah, no, I appreciate your time, Lydia, your insight. I mean, I think you are a great example to what it means to just simply put the work in. I've seen it as I followed you on social media and on Facebook. You put the time in. You demonstrate love in your own life to your kids and your husband. It's obvious, and I think as we kind of navigate where we're at as a culture and a society, it's going to take networking and building. We said early on that you kind of you can't fight culture unless you have a culture of your own to replace it with. You can't just make attacks on culture and rail against culture and say it's terrible. So I think, if people are out there and they're doing things, even if our podcast only has 10 viewers or 15 viewers, or like, even in and of that self, we attempt to build things, and I think you're building things, and I think it's great. So thank you for the time and the example and the encouragement that you provided and all that.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was fun.
Yeah. All right. Well, until next time, guys. We'll talk to you later.